Hi boys and girls out there on the internet, this is Kelly from Nice Lady Productions, and today we're going to be looking at the video shooting capabilities of the Nikon EVF. This camera is 4.4 inches wide by 2.6 in height and just 1.3 inches deep, so it is small. Very well built, feels good in the hands. The camera comes with a Nikon One mount, which is built for their small mirrorless camera system. If you can go for the Prime 18.5, which is a 50mm equivalent on a full-frame Nikon camera, instead of going for the 10 to 30 kit lens, I think you'll be much happier as far as low light capabilities goes. There are two primary mode dials on the camera. One is in the very front. It kind of seems awkward that it would be in this kind of vertical position. This is for changing your aperture or changing anything else you want to have it programmed to, depending on what mode you're in. And then the back dials for your shutter speed or your ISO, depending or what even white balance, depending on what you want to program it to. And if you get the additional grip, you can add a third button, which you also have a bunch of options of what you can program it to. There are really two incredible standout features with this camera as far as the build goes. One is a 3-inch over 1,000 pixel touch screen. This thing flips out. It can be used for low-mo shooting, and the touch capability of the screen is great for reviewing photos. You can swipe across. You can do a pinch zoom on the touch screen to zoom into the image when you are reviewing it. And of course, all the menu options on it are touch. Great for shooting on a Steadicam like the Steadicam Merlin. Here you can see I'm grabbing some shots from a low angle, moving all the way up, and then of course following my little Chihuahua Maya around in a low-mo shot. Even just being able to put the camera down on a rock and shoot the ocean and be able to flip that screen up to get this low-mode shot. The second standout feature as far as build goes for this camera that I'm absolutely in love with is the optional EVF that goes on the top of the camera. This is an electronic viewfinder. There's a button on the side where you can turn the EVF on or off, and you can also have it set to automatically turn on and off when you put your eye to it or even your hand. I mean, it'll sense any movement in front of it and it'll turn off the back screen. That feature you can turn on and off. There's times when you're shooting and you're using a screen. I mean, maybe it's bright outside or it's not, when the screen can be a bit misleading. So here I'm looking at the image and it's saying that it's exposed properly. Now to my eye, I can see that the pool of water is exposed properly, but the rest of the greenery is blown out. Sometimes you don't want to necessarily trust the camera because the image is too complicated for it to understand what should be and what shouldn't be exposed, which is one of the reasons I always shoot manually. When you have an EVF, you can look through it and not have any kind of light transfer hitting the image and see even more clearly with your eye. No, you know what? This is not exposed properly. This is how I would do it. So if you watch my reviews, you know that I never shoot in automatic mode, but let's just try this camera in automatic mode and see what it produces. Here's my very vicious Chihuahua trying to make the bed out of her bed. The reason I don't use auto mode is because I like to have complete control over my settings. I don't want the camera making choices for me. Now, normally in a camera, a DSLR, you would choose the manual mode and then shoot video in that. On the Nikon EVF, you're going to want to shoot in the advanced video camera mode. If you're interested in picture styles, check out my video on the Nikon D800. I walk you through what they all mean and why there's a difference in your image if you're using them. I always shoot neutral picture style, and I always edit that picture style to my liking. The built-in microphone in the camera was pretty nice for what it is. It does have control as far as setting it to automatic, or you can set a specific level so that you know that you're not going to clip the audio, say if you're shooting at a concert or something. I found that the autofocus when shooting video or even taking photographs was very responsive and very much accurate. I think that has a lot to do with the 171 focusing points that it has built into it. You know, this camera is really sitting on the fence of being a professional camera and being a camera for someone who's trying to get past the photo capabilities of their iPhone. The Wi-Fi capabilities built into the camera are brilliant. Once you sync it with your phone, you directly upload it to your phone, and boom, you're sharing it with the world. You're able to view the images, you pick the ones that you want to upload. The picture quality of this camera is way better than your iPhone. It has toy camera, it has a panoramic mode. It's nice to have those options in a more higher end camera. Let's talk about white balance. When you're shooting RAW, it's not such a big deal, but when you're shooting video, it's a massive deal. I set it in the pre-mode, so this camera is professional enough that it has a pre-mode. I always use the Colorchecker Passport. I either manually set the camera to it, or I even just take a photo of the Colorchecker Passport, and then in post, I use an eyedropper tool, or I set the color to match. You set it in front of the camera, full screen, and then you set the pre-mode, and from then on you have one mode that is programmed in there. And say you always shot in the same studio. Well, if you program this on one day using the same kind of lights, it doesn't matter if you just change the lights. You're always going to have that same white balance. You don't want to have unnatural skin tones because you didn't set your white balance properly. All right, how about the video quality overall? Nikon took the anti-aliasing filter out of this camera in order to make the images sharper. This camera is fantastic when it comes to Moire, and I also did a rolling shutter test where you're looking at when you're doing a whip pan, really fast pan. I don't have an example here, but when you're doing a fast pan with the camera, I found the rolling shutter as well really good. I mean, really what we're talking about here is a camera that's pocketable. It's a camera you could throw in your bag that looks sexy when you pull it out. And one of the things I love to do is shoot time lapse. So let's talk about the photo quality capabilities. The one thing I noticed with time lapse shooting with this camera, which I've noticed on other cameras, the screen monitor doesn't show the same image in the display as what it's actually taking. Those are the settings I had when I first started the time lapse. So just be aware of this if you are shooting time lapse with this camera. But look at the image quality. These are all shot raw. I just shot them and I threw them on the timeline. Pretty impressive, I think. Now there are a few little tricks that this camera has up its sleeve. It has high def 1080p 30 and 60 frames per second shooting. It also has 720p at 120 frames per second shooting, which I didn't test, but don't ask me why. So let's just look at the normal video shooting mode first. 1080p 60 frames per second, and I've thrown all this footage in a 24 frames per second timeline, so keep that in mind when you're watching this. This is a very interesting camera. It has 3 slow motion settings in this camera. One is 1200 frames per second, which is an odd resolution and basically unusable unless you're looking at the back of the camera that you shot it on. Now, if I don't expand the view, this is about what it looks like, which is clear. As soon as I expand it, the resolution is just so blurry, it's crazy. But the camera also has a 400 frames per second mode at 768 by 288 frames per second. I did not shoot in this mode. And it also has a 720p mode that is at 120 frames per second. Don't ask me why I didn't test this, but I didn't. I love that this camera has slow motion shooting capabilities. I want them to be in full 1080p mode. Please, Nikon. And it also has a 4-second mode. It takes 4 seconds at some point in the shooting and it just slow-mos it. Interesting concept. Here's some 1080p 60 frames per second footage. And here is the 4-second shooting mode. Let's talk about electronic vibration reduction. So here is the typical situation. You're walking and shooting, which is kind of a nightmare. Let's look at what happens if I shoot without vibration reduction on. And now let's look at what happens when I shoot with it on. Certainly less movement, maybe a little bit of electronic compensation, but it seems smoother overall. And lastly, let's do a low light test. So let's start with ISO 800. Really, to me, pretty clean for being such a small sensor. I probably, like most DSLRs even, wouldn't shoot over 800. That's just my preference. 1600, okay, maybe. This is ISO 1600 that I'm shooting all these fireworks, and I'm going between the regular 1080p and the slow motion 1200 frames per second. Man, do I ever wish this was 1080p. If I could ask Nikon to do anything, it would be drop the price, give me 24 frames per second, give me high speed slow motion shooting at 1080p, and please up the dynamic range just a bit. That's it from me. Take care.